you so much. One of the greatest gifts that the founders of our nation bequeathed to us is open borders. Imagine, we are able to travel from one state into another state, without ever seeing at the border an immigration official or a customs official. We can take flights on interstate airlines from one airport in one state to an airport in another state and just go pick up our luggage and go about our business without having to undergo the humiliating experience of standing in a line so that some petty government bureaucrat can ask us prying questions about where we're from, asking for identity papers, or prying and digging into our luggage or personal effects. The founders gave us the greatest, the biggest, the largest free trade zone in history, and the biggest zone for the free movements of people that mankind has ever seen. And it, of course, has contributed to one of the highest standards of living that man has ever seen. Because they understood that when people are free to move, to better their way of life, to engage in mutually beneficial trades with one another, their standard of living tends to rise. And make no mistake about it, the only reason, and I underscore only reason, we don't have trade restrictions and immigration controls, walls around each state, is because the founders had the wisdom and foresight to understand that down the line in this country, there were apt to be people who favored these things, who favored the building of walls around their respective societies. And the reason we don't have these is because of this constitutional prohibition. And how do we know this? Because we know that Democrats and Republicans, who control the state houses, who control virtually all the governorships, are people who are ardently and fervently committed to the concept of immigration controls and trade restrictions. But for that Constitution and a Supreme Court that would slam them down, there is no doubt that this nation would be riddled with these kind of restrictions and interventions. We could imagine, for example, the governor of Iowa getting into a trade war with the governor of Florida. Why, it's just not right. There's a trade imbalance. Why Iowans are down there spending money in Disney World, fishing down at Key West, and those Floridians, why they're just not buying enough of our Iowa hogs. Something's got to be done. There's a trade imbalance. If something's not done, Iowa will cease to exist as a state. And there would be trade summits, trade negotiations. All the nonsense that you see Democrats and Republicans engaged in the international arena, you would see on an interstate basis. There would be immigration controls between the respective states. Texas, controlled by Democrats and Republicans, would undoubtedly immediately impose immigration controls on people from the north. I guarantee you walk into stores around Texas and there's tremendous prejudice. You see signs like, "We don't care how you did it in New York." So clearly they'd be imposing immigration restrictions on these unusual people known as New Yorkers. What protects us as Americans from this type of conduct, from these people, is the Constitution. We libertarians stand in a different position from these people. We stand for principles of individual liberty, private property, free markets, and in an international arena, the free movements of goods and services. We apply the principles that our founders bequeathed to us on a domestic basis to the international arena. I think it's always important when we come to events like this to remind ourselves of our principles, the principles that we have devoted our lives and our fortunes to. Libertarian philosophy is a fairly simple philosophy, but has deep roots, philosophical roots. It's a rich heritage. In the words of Leonard E. Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington, New York, anything that's peaceful is what we stand for. That principle. That is to say that a person should be free to do whatever he wants in his life as long as his conduct is peaceful. So that as long as a person doesn't murder or rape or steal or burglarize or trespass or defraud or engage in that type of conduct, he should be free to live his life any way he chooses, without being punished by the majority, by society, by the collective, by the state, by the government, even if, or perhaps especially if his conduct is disapproved of by everyone else. That is the essence of human freedom. Our heritage stretches back to the English philosopher as far back as John Locke, who talked about private property and natural rights and individual liberty and limited government. To the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, who talked about free markets and free enterprise and economic liberty. To the founders like Madison, Jefferson, Washington, that talked about the importance of the Declaration of Independence, the importance of constitutional restrictions on government power. Into the 20th century, to economists like Ludwig von Mises, or the Nobel Prize-winning economist, the libertarian Friedrich Hayek. Our heritage is a rich one, and we should take great pride in the heritage to which we are devoted. But it's also important to remind ourselves of some of the aspects of libertarianism that we've stood for, that we should take pride in. For example, we have consistently and continually, ardently opposed one of the most immoral and destructive wars in the history of this country, this government program called the War on Drugs. We have stood against that war on moral grounds, on utilitarian grounds. I mean, this is a war that is so highly destructive of the well-being of American society. It's tearing apart the fabric of American society. And all they do is want to spend more money to make things worse. $100 million to the DEA, $100 million to the Colombian government, $100 million to DARE, $100 million to children who turn in their parents, $100 million to racially profile Hispanics and blacks in this drug war, $100 million to confiscate a few more assets from people. And things just keep getting worse and worse and worse. But now the American people are discovering the scam, that it's always been about money and power. Money and power by politicians, bureaucrats, and drug lords, all three of which would by and large be put out of business with their money and power if you followed what us libertarians have said. And now you got Democrats and Republicans saying, you libertarians have been right from the beginning to oppose that war. You got the governor of New Mexico talking about it. You got the mayor of Baltimore. You got Bill Buckley. They're now talking about, the ex-Surgeon General, talking about what we've been saying for decades. It's time to end this immoral and destructive war. 6 years ago, this movement took a principled stand against other people who have been harmed by the state, the tyranny of the state. When Democrats and Republicans were talking about, those weirdos and those cultists and those wackos and let's just sweep this investigation under the carpet, let them bulldoze down the site, let's not even look into it, let's put it behind us. It was the libertarian movement from the very beginning that said no. The federal wrongdoers must be brought to account for what has happened in Waco. We had courageous journalists like James Bovard, the author of that great new book, Freedom in Chains, The Rise of the State and the Demise of the Citizen, writing editorials in the mainstream press, raising the consciousness of the American people to the point now where in the press you've got Democrats, Republicans saying you libertarians were right from the beginning. The federal wrongdoers have to be brought to an account. So we have to take great pride in these principled stands where we stood against those in society that would be willing to accede to what to government wrongdoing of this nature. We've got, in the area of immigration, reason to be proud. This is a movement that has always stood for the rights of immigrants to be free from INS raids and INS abuses and Border Patrol killings and walls around America. We've stood for the downtrodden, and we have a reason to be proud of that. You see, it's always easy to take positions when everyone else in society supports those positions. No problem with that. It's not so easy to take the positions when everyone else in society is standing against you. This was what Frederick Bastiat, the great French free marketeer in France in the 19th century. He was essentially a man alone, standing against the tide of interventionism and socialism in France. And oftentimes this is what we have done as libertarians. And the libertarian movement has been very courageous in a world that is moving toward closed borders, closed societies, including many people here in the United States. The Advocates for Self-Government is one of those organizations, taking this principle stand, selling these great audio tapes and videotapes, including at the forefront, one on open immigration. They've always had the courage of their convictions in this foundation. They've got this great website, www.self-gov.org, where they also on that website list tons of other libertarian organizations that you can access. You know, the big organizations like the Cato Institute that has published these great studies showing that increased immigration is a great boon to a society. It's a benefit to a society. The Reason Foundation that publishes Reason Magazine publishes the same types of articles. They're linking to international organizations like the International Society for Individual Liberty that talks about the free movements of people internationally. So this is a great organization under the directorship of Sharon Harris, and before that Carol Ann Rand, and before that Marshall Fritz. It's an organization worth getting involved in. I'm grateful to be part of this conference. 15th anniversary conference. What a great celebration of advancing liberty. We've got the Libertarian Party that has always had, or at least for many years has had, the Statue of Liberty as its logo. And of course we have the Future of Freedom Foundation, where I serve as president, having published the leading book in the movement, The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. So this is a movement that has taken the moral high ground. Our principles are consistent with the Sermon on the Mount. We treat people the way we would want to be treated ourselves. And we know that our principles not only are right, but they result in greater harmonies and greater economic prosperities for people everywhere. Now compare this to the other people. Democrats, Republicans, interventionists, leftists, socialists, conservatives, whatever label you want to put on those people. Doesn't matter, because they all have the same vision. I mean, look what they've done to this country. They've created this monumental socialistic welfare state. You know, public this, public that, public retirement, public Social Security, public schools, public works, public Medicare and Medicaid, public hospitals, public everything. They see government as their God. Government providing everything for them. And what's their rationale? They say, because we love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. And that's their justification when you oppose a HUD project or any of these other projects supposedly for the poor. Oh, you must hate the poor. And the engine, the financial engine that drives all this is the Internal Revenue Service. I mean, that collects most of the money to finance this huge engine. And who can dispute that the Internal Revenue Service is one of the most tyrannical agencies, the sponsor of state-sponsored terrorism in the world? I mean, I would submit that the IRS inflicts more terror on people than even the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. You know, the ATF, by and large, attacks people on the fringe, the Weaver family, the Waco, and so forth. But the IRS attacks everybody in the middle. Everybody feels the terror of the IRS. That's why we have published this great new book called Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax by Sheldon Richman. But you see, it's all driving this thing saying, we love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. All of this socialistic welfare state. And that you ask them, you say, well, wait a minute. If you love the poor so much, is this a genuine love for the poor like a la Mother Teresa or something? How come you're treating these immigrants that are trying to come into America just to better their lives in such a horrible fashion? How come you're building a wall down there on the southern border, a reinforced wall with barbed wire? You know, it always amuses me that conservatives, kept calling for the dismantling of the Berlin Wall for all those years. Well, why didn't they just call for its removal? It's removal to the southern border of the United States. Because that's what they want to build, a reinforced wall down there. Because they love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. They're killing people down there in confrontations. Look, walls have never stopped people from trying to better their lives. We learned that in the Berlin Wall. People would risk their lives to better their way of life. It's the same on the southern border. People are now circumventing that wall. They're going out on lonely deserts. They're dying of thirst. They're dying of heat exhaustion. They've been dying in railroad cars and the trunks of cars, and always the interventionists say, oh, it's the transporter, it's the coyote that bears the responsibility. He's not the only one who bears the responsibility. It's those who build the walls and those who support the building of the walls that bear the moral responsibility for those deaths. I don't know how many of you caught what happened in Miami Harbor a couple of months ago, but it was one of the most horrific scenes, live television. Agents of the United States Coast Guard, you felt like you were in Burma or something, were attacking defenseless Cuban refugees in rafts. People who had fled communist tyranny across shark-infested waters, a few hundred yards from American shores, came under attack from United States Coast Guard officials with water cannons, firing water cannons at these people while they're in the rafts. Then they tried pepper spray on them. The reason? They were trying to capture them before they set foot on American shores so that they could do what they've been doing for a few years now, repatriating people into Cuban communist tyranny. What they do is they radio their Cuban communist Coast Guard comrades, and the two boats hook up, and the American officials force women and children and people who have fled communist tyranny back into communism. It's a reflection of the depths of depravity and morality which Democrats and Republicans have plunged this nation. It was the most incredible sight to see that type of thing taking place in this country. But remember, they love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. I often think that maybe the dictionary ought to modify that term, the definition of that term, hypocrisy, by just saying Democrats and Republicans. Okay, what are the objections they throw at us? Oh, well, they're coming over here to get on welfare. The immigrants are just coming over here to get on welfare. Well, a lot of this is projection. There's no doubt Democrats and Republicans, or whatever labels, leftists, conservatives, they're hooked. It's like a drug. They're hooked on their little socialistic welfare programs. You say to a Democrat or Republican, how about repealing Social Security? Oh, God, how would we live without Social Security? Even though Americans live without Social Security, the socialistic program, for over 100 years. Or, public schooling. How about a free market in education instead of government schooling? Well, yeah. Well, I don't know if you've ever said that word free market to a leftist or a conservative in America, but it's like holding a cross to a vampire. Oh, gosh, how would our children get educated if the state didn't do it? Oh, we might have to take responsibility for finding the right educational vehicle for our children, heaven forbid. You see, so they have this love, they're hooked. you can imagine a great big hall, and Democrats and Republicans are in there sucking on their welfare opium pipes and scared to death that new people are going to come in and start sucking off the pipes too. You know? Well, the truth is that most immigrants couldn't give a hoot for their welfare programs. They come in here because they want to work, okay? They're risking their lives, they're leaving their culture, they're leaving their family, they're leaving their language, and they're coming in here because they have what 19th century Americans had before the socialistic welfare state came into existence. They have a strong work ethic. I've worked with these people. I've worked in the fields with many Mexican illegal aliens. And I'll tell you, you'll never find harder working people. And I've talked to businessmen. Businessmen will tell you the hardest working people you'll ever find. And they're very family oriented. They come in here, they risk their lives in order to save some money, in order to send it back to their children, to their grandparents, their wives, their husbands. Very family oriented, very religious people, very strong Christians mostly. And I mean, you would think these are the traits that a society should relish, should embrace, but not Democrats and Republicans. You know, evict these people, repatriate them. I mean, what they're doing in Cuba, you know, remember, 30 years ago, Democrats and Republicans, under their idols, Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, sent, what, 50, 60,000 American men to their deaths in Southeast Asia? Remember they were drafting them for freedom? And they said, well, but we want them to go over there to die because communism's so bad. Apparently communism's not so bad anymore, because now we're repatriating. You've got ships from Red China that come over here with these Chinese refugees that have paid $50,000 to get out of there, packed like sardines in these ships, just anything to get to America. And our government diverts them, shifts them aside in order to send them back, in order that they be sent back to their country of origin, Red China. And this is not the first time that this has happened. Recall their idol, Franklin Roosevelt. Both Democrats and Republicans idolized Roosevelt, the beginner of the socialistic welfare state in America, the lover of the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. Roosevelt used immigration controls to repatriate Mexican citizens who had been here for decades, legally. Because from the time the Mexican War ended, when we took over the northern half of Mexico, till pretty much 1930, there was open borders. People were crossing back and forth, visiting with family, friends, opening business. Nobody cared. Until Roosevelt came along and started repatriating them, using immigration controls. And remember what he did to the Jews from Nazi Germany. Would not let them into America because we have immigration controls, he said. Remember what has become known as the infamous Voyage of the Damned. They were damned because Roosevelt and the State Department damned them. A ship of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany on the ship the St. Louis had gone to Havana Harbor, tried to disembark. They wouldn't permit them, even though their family and friends were there. They said, no problem, we'll go to Miami and disembark. Roosevelt's administration put out the order, no Jew would be permitted to disembark from the St. Louis. And they made the Coast Guard go around that ship to make sure nobody jumped ship and pollute American shores. That ship was heading back to Nazi Germany because no other country would take them until at the last minute, some of the European countries finally accepted them. And those that ended up on the continent ended up in the ovens anyway. Now, if the greatest lover of the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged that the Republicans and Democrats idolize so much, Franklin Roosevelt, would do this with immigration controls, how can anyone be trusted with immigration controls? They say to us, well, but they're not going to speak English when they come in. And so? I mean, who cares? The Italians came in, the waves in the 19th century, immigrants, they couldn't speak English. They seem to have done okay. Even the Irish learned English after a while. But it's the same, the first generation can't speak English, then the children come along and they learn English and they're embarrassed because their parents can't speak English, or their grandparents speak with an accent or whatever. But what difference does it make if people are speaking the language? The language that you speak doesn't determine how ethical you are, how moral you are, how educated you are. It just means you communicate in a different language. Who cares, you know? I mean, they say, oh, well, they're going to go hang out with each other. And so, you got, you know, you've got Little Italy, you got Chinatown, and, you know, look, Democrats and Republicans, interventionists, leftists, conservatives, they've always had this concept of control, that people have to be controlled. So they, Democrats and Republicans, were ardent supporters for decades of segregation laws. Remember that. They said the races should be segregated by law. Well, then the mood changes and they say, well, now we got to integrate the races by law. Well, you know, why not just have a society where people are free to hang out who you want to hang out with, or don't hang out who you don't want to hang out with? You see, but if you have a mindset of control, it doesn't matter whether it's segregation or integration, as long as you're controlling the lives of people. They say, well, they're going to send criminals and deadbeats, like Fidel Castro. He's going to send his criminals and deadbeats to the United States. Well, I wouldn't put any stock in who Fidel Castro defines as a criminal. I mean, look, he's a conservative's dream. He doesn't believe in constitutional technicalities. You know, he doesn't, you know, right to counsel, due process, none of that. This is what conservatives love, you know. Hey, you believe he's guilty, put him in jail. And anyway, it's my understanding is, I mean, we're here in the state of Georgia. Wasn't this the state that was populated by criminals and deadbeats? Y'all haven't turned out that bad. Well, they also tell you, wait a minute, but one culture. We got to have one culture in America. These people are going to pollute our culture. Well, yeah, duh. You're like, where's the one culture? I mean, you know, we libertarians believe in a culture of freedom, a culture of diversity. I mean, compare Charleston, South Carolina to Boston, Massachusetts. I guarantee you, you'll find a difference in culture. You can go to New Orleans and find a French culture. Go to San Francisco and in certain parts find a very Oriental culture. Or you can go to the Southwest, what used to be the northern half of Mexico, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and find a very Spanish, Mexican, Indian culture. This is something great. You know, I mean, but look, if we're only going to have one culture, and that's what they say, oh, we got to have a white, Anglo-Saxon, Northern European culture in America. You know, got to get more Englishmen in here. I mean, that's all we need, you know, these pompous, hooty-tooty nose in the air coming into America and telling us how we're going to live our lives. But look, if we're going to do this, then we ought to put it to a vote. I mean, that's what they tell us, the majority rule and so forth. So let's have a vote as to which culture we're going to have. Now, Hispanics are the rapidly growing minority in America. So Hispanics could win a vote like that. Okay, now imagine what that would mean. Pat Buchanan, every day, having to eat enchiladas and tacos. No, and then Pat Buchanan every day having to listen to music by Celia Cruz, Gloria Estefan, Ricky Martin, or maybe some of the old-timers for him, like Antonio Aguilar. Pat Buchanan having to learn how to salsa and merengue. I mean, you can just picture Pat Buchanan humming to himself, "Viva la vida loca," as he drinks his Corona cerveza. Now, I guarantee you, there's people in the borderlands in the Southwest that would tell you, life doesn't get any better than that. Que vida tan maravillosa. My friends, libertarian friends, my fellow libertarians, we have always stood for principle, and it is important that we continue doing that. We stand with the Christian principle, the second greatest commandment that our Lord gave us. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And we've stood with that principle. We stand for the dismantling of walls. We stand for the opening of doors, as Gloria Estefan says, abriendo puertas. We don't need walls. We don't need barriers. What we need is abrazos and amistades between the peoples of the world. Now, some of you have heard me tell you the story of the Oriental nurse in my doctor's office. She was writing some notes down, and I said, "Where are you from?" And she says, "I'm from Vietnam." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you very much for coming such a long way and helping us out in this country." And she stopped, and she looked up, and she had tears coming down her eyes, and she says, "Mr. Hornberger, no one has ever said that to me before." And she says, "Why are people so mean to me? Don't they know what I've gone through to get to this country?" And I said, "No, ma'am, they don't know, and they don't understand. But there's a lot of us who do, and we're very, very grateful for what you immigrants have done. You've brought a spirit, you've brought a vitality, you've brought entrepreneurship, ingenuity, your culture, your diversity, your courage. And there are many of us who are very, very grateful for that." Last spring, I spent a week in Cuba, and it was a time of great tension, which I guess there always is in Cuba, but there was especially more tension because there were people on trial, dissidents on trial for criticizing the revolution. There was an El Salvadorian who was accused of terroristic bombing with supposed ties to people in Miami. This was being shown on national television. There was tension in the air. But the Cuban people, I found, are the most genuine, the most sincere, the most honest people I've ever encountered, people on the streets. And as long as they knew that no one was monitoring our conversation, and they felt like they could trust me, they were very open in their conversations. In fact, oftentimes I'd say, "Why are you so courteous to me after what our government has done to you with this embargo?" And their answer was always the same, very, very interesting and very revealing. "What fault do you have for what your government does?" But I was in one beautiful little town, albeit very impoverished because of their socialist system there, called Trinidad. And this young man comes up to me, and he realizes I'm from the United States, and he asked me if I would enter a doorway where nobody can see us or hear us. And he says, "Sir," he was about 20, 21 years old. He says, "Sir, I am a faithful admirer of the United States of America." He says, "In your country, you have freedom of speech. Here in Cuba, we can't criticize the government because of what they'll do to us." But he says, "You have freedom of speech." He says, "Most Cubans who wish to leave the country want to go to Miami." He says, "Not I." He says, "My dream is to go to New York City and see the Statue of Liberty." And I said to him, freedom of speech is important. It's vitally important, but it's not sufficient. I said, unfortunately, in my country, there are people who have led our country in a wrong direction, into the socialist principles that guide your country. That you have public schooling here. It's Fidel Castro's greatest accomplishment, his proudest accomplishment, and certainly not his greatest. You have national health care here. You have gun control, drug laws, occupational licensure. And I said, these are the types of controls that our country has now adopted, including the embargo, which is just another form of economic control, the kind that Fidel Castro has here in your country. But there are people in the United States called libertarians that are fighting to recapture the principles that that great statue once stood for. And so one of these days I told him, I said, "You're going to see New York City. You're going to see the Statue of Liberty. But I hope it's because we have economic liberty in our two nations and the free movements of goods and services between our people once again." My fellow libertarians, it is incumbent on us to stick with our principles, have the integrity of our convictions, to stand against the mass if necessary, to relight that torch on that statue that Democrats and Republicans, leftists and conservatives have extinguished, and to openly declare the words to the world, to those in political dungeons, to those in famine fields, to those who wish to better their lives, the words on that majestic statue. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore, Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I light my lamp beside the golden door. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
What I tell you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank
What
you
did
very
I
much.
tell you? We have a few minutes if anyone would like to ask Jacob a question. We have 10 minutes for questions. What we'd like to do in here is have you come forward and use this microphone. So if anyone who would like to ask a question, if you can just come forward, we'll let you ask a question. Who's first?
Thank you very much. One issue that you didn't address, which is the one I hear most often, is that these immigrants will take jobs from Americans. And how would you respond to that issue?
You know, it's really unfortunate that the American people have gotten to the point where they're so fearful of competition. I mean, you know, we really need to recapture the sense of self-esteem that Nathaniel Branden has written so much about, self-confidence that once characterized the American people. There was a time when Americans didn't fear competition from anybody. We believed in ourselves and so forth. We should never fear competition from others, whether they're others from another state or people from another country. But actually what history has shown and what economic principle has shown is that while labor comes into a particular sector and might displace the people in that sector, the division of labor that results for society overall is tremendously beneficial. In other words, those workers that are displaced mostly in lower echelon jobs, busboys or farm hands or ranch hands, you look at it and you say, well, by golly, they lost their job. But you have to look at what is unseen. This new influx of people, the immigrants, are out there looking for homes. They're looking for clothing for their children or for themselves. They're looking for groceries. They're looking for an automobile. This generates economic opportunities for the previously displaced people to move up in society in more higher paying jobs. So open immigration is not a burden, it's a tremendous economic boon. We saw that in the 19th century, where standards of living were soaring in the United States, you know, especially because of free immigration. We saw it in Argentina also, which once had one of the highest standards of living because they had open immigration and very little taxation and regulation.
Are there any other questions? If anyone else has a question, would you please come on up here so we won't have to waste the time waiting for you?
I agree with you in principle, but doesn't the welfare programs and other enticements to come here to get out of work, does that not contaminate it?
Well, that's the argument that's always made, that people come here to get on welfare. Well, you know, the interventionists, the Democrats and Republicans, have created the socialistic welfare state. And we should never permit them to trap us who advocate liberty and stand against socialism into supporting any aspect of tyranny. I mean, if they create these programs, it is incumbent on them to figure out the ways to limit this heroin, this narcotic, to citizens. Now, we have to keep in mind that while they believe these programs, public schooling, public this, public that, Social Security and so forth, are benefits, we know what a lot of people are discovered in America. They are actually detriments to people. And that if we can persuade immigrants that these things are not beneficial, then we hit it at that side also. Now, let's keep in mind also that when people come in here and work, they're paying taxes. They're having money withheld from them on their payroll taxes. They're paying sales taxes on things they're buying. They're paying real estate taxes on the homes that they're either renting or buying. So they're supporting the socialistic welfare state. And many times, they never are going to claim on their Social Security 40, 50 years later when they're back in their home countries. Many of them don't ask for their withholding that's been taken out, their overage in their payments. So the studies that Cato Institute and so forth have done is that economically, on balance, immigration has been a tremendous economic benefit. The other part of this is that maybe we ought to start looking at punishing bureaucrats for distributing this dole to non-citizens instead of castigating the citizens. You give a 5-year mandatory minimum to a bureaucrat caught giving welfare to a non-citizen, I guarantee you no American bureaucrat's going to risk his life for some foreigner. Liberty.
Be very brief. Regarding the wall and fences that you mentioned that are being built across our southern border, how can you be so sure they're being built to keep people out exclusively?
One can never quite be sure, but one good sign perhaps is in which direction they point their guns. But maybe even you've got a point. Yeah, you know, sometimes people say, well, the Berlin Wall is different because they were trying to keep people from leaving the country, and over here they're trying to keep people from entering the country. Well, you know, for a person crossing a wall, I'm not sure it really matters to him what direction the bullet comes from. If that wall they're building along the southern border is manned by Mexican government officials that are paid by the U.S. government to enforce the wall, and they start shooting from that direction, what's the difference to somebody who's trying to cross the wall? But your question's a good one.
Any further questions? Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Jacob.
Sharon. Thank you all very much.